Hello, everyone. Today, I want to tell you a simple love story. It is the story of Shani and Dan. Shani and Dan were two young people who cared about each other. They lived in a small and quiet town. They were not rich. They did not have expensive clothes or expensive gifts. But they had something very special. They had kindness. They had trust. And they cared about each other. Every morning, Dan waited to see Shani. He usually stood near a small tree on the road. He waited quietly. Then, when he saw Shani walking toward him, he smiled. Shani always noticed his smile. She liked his kind smile. She also liked the way Dan listened to her. When Shani talked, Dan did not look at his phone. He did not look away. He listened carefully. Sometimes Shani talked about her dreams. Sometimes she talked about her problems. And sometimes she talked about small things that happened during her day. Dan always listened. One morning, Shani came to him with a sad face. Dan looked at her and asked, "Shani, are you okay?" Shani smiled a little and said, "Yes, I am okay." But Dan knew she was not okay. He said, "You can tell me if something is wrong." Shani looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sometimes I feel that nobody understands me." Dan smiled gently. He said, "I may not understand everything, but I will always listen to you." Shani felt happy. It was a simple sentence, but it meant a lot to her. She realized that sometimes people do not need big words. Sometimes they only need someone who listens. As the days passed, Shani and Dan became closer. They walked together. They talked together. They laughed together. They also helped each other. One day, Dan had a difficult day. He was tired and worried about his future. He sat quietly under the same tree. Shani saw him. She walked toward him and sat beside him. She did not ask many questions. She simply stayed with him. After a few minutes, Dan looked at her and smiled. He said, "Thank you for staying." Shani said, "You stayed with me when I was sad. Now I can stay with you." Dan smiled again. That day, he understood something important. Love was not only about happy moments. Love was also about staying when life became difficult. A few days later, Dan wanted to say something important to Shani. They were walking together in the evening. The sky was quiet. The wind was soft. Dan stopped. He looked at Shani and said, "Shani, you make my days happy." Shani looked at him. She smiled. Then she said, "And you make my heart feel warm." They both laughed. They did not need expensive gifts. They did not need beautiful restaurants. They did not need a perfect life. A simple smile was enough. A kind word was enough. A little time together was enough. Their happiness was in the small things. Sometimes Dan brought Shani a small flower. Dan said, "One day I want to have a peaceful home." Shani smiled and said, "I want that too." Dan asked, "What will our home be like?" Shani laughed. "It does not need to be big." Dan said, "What does it need?" Shani looked at him and said, "It needs love." Dan smiled. "And kindness." Shani nodded. "And trust." They both became quiet. They knew that a happy future was not about having everything. It was about having the right person beside you. But their journey was not always easy. Sometimes they disagreed. Sometimes they became angry. Sometimes they did not understand each other. One day they had a small argument. Dan was upset. Shani was upset too. They walked away from each other. That evening, both of them felt sad. They realized that being angry did not make the problem disappear. The next morning, Dan went to see Shani. He said, "I'm sorry." Shani looked at him. She also said, "I'm sorry." They smiled. Then Dan said, "We do not have to agree about everything." Shani nodded, "But we should always respect each other." Dan smiled. Yes, that small moment made their relationship stronger. They learned that true love is not perfect. True love needs patience. It needs forgiveness. It needs understanding. And most importantly, it needs trust. As time passed, Shani and Dan continued walking together. They continued talking. They continued helping each other. They dreamed about the future. They knew that life could bring good days and bad days. There would be happy mornings. There would also be difficult nights, but they wanted to face those days together. One evening, Shani asked Dan, "Why do you love me?" Dan smiled and said, "Because you make me feel understood." Then he asked, "Why do you love me?" Shani smiled. "Because you listen to me." Dan laughed. "Only because I listen." Shani laughed too. "No, because you are kind." They looked at each other. For a moment, they said nothing. They did not need to. Their smiles said enough. Shani and Dan knew that true love was not only about beautiful words. It was about trust. It was about kindness. It was about listening. It was about forgiving. And it was about staying together in good and bad days. Their love was simple, but it was real. They did not know exactly what the future would bring. But they knew one thing. Every morning they would try again. Every difficult day they would help each other. And every happy day they would enjoy it together. And every day Shani and Dan chose each other again. Because sometimes the greatest love is not found in expensive gifts or beautiful words. Sometimes it is found in a simple smile, a kind word, a listening heart, and someone who says, "I'm here for you." Thank you for listening to the story of Shani and Dan. If you enjoyed this story, Please stay with us for more simple and beautiful stories. See you in the next video. Goodbye.